The CEO sat behind his grand mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching behind him like a kingdom under his rule. He had built this empire from the ground up, through hard work, smart deals, and, when necessary, ruthless decisions. He glanced at the reports in front of him. Profits were up. Competitors were struggling. Another successful quarter. Another proof that his way of doing business worked. Then, a soft knock at the door. His secretary's voice was hesitant. "Sir, there's a young man here to see you. He won't leave." The CEO barely looked up. "Send him away." She hesitated. "I've tried, but, he insists. He says it's important." Irritated, the CEO sighed. "Does he have an appointment?" "No, sir, but, then I don't have time for him." He waved a hand dismissively. But just as she turned to leave, she froze. The CEO frowned. "What?" Her voice was uneasy. He says you'll want to hear him out. That if you don't, you'll regret it." The words made the CEO pause, but only for a second. He had heard threats before. Empty words from people who thought they mattered. Still, something about the way his secretary looked, something about her voice, unsettled him. He exhaled sharply. "Fine. 5 minutes." She stepped aside, and the young man walked in. The CEO's first thought was that he looked oddly familiar. Yet, he was sure he had never seen him before. He was tall, lean but not weak. His presence was unnerving. His gaze was sharp, almost too sharp, as if he could see straight through the CEO's very soul. But what disturbed him most were his eyes. There was something in them. Not hatred. Not anger. But something deeper. Something ancient. The young man pulled out a chair and sat down without invitation. The CEO narrowed his eyes. "You have 5 minutes." The young man smirked. "That's all I need." Then, he leaned forward and said words that made the CEO's blood run cold. "You don't recognize me, do you?" The CEO stiffened. The young man tilted his head, his smile fading. "But I remember you. I remember everything." For the first time in years, the CEO felt something he had long forgotten. Fear. The office, usually a place of control and order, felt suffocating. The CEO leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression neutral. He had faced countless rivals, handled million-dollar deals, and crushed obstacles without hesitation. But this was different. The young man sat across from him, unmoving. His gaze was steady, patient. Like he was waiting for something. The CEO cleared his throat. "Who are you?" The young man's lips curved into a faint smile. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is who you were, and what you did." The CEO's stomach twisted. He had made tough choices in business, yes. Had to fire employees. End contracts. Cut losses. It was all part of the game. "I've fired many people," the CEO said coldly. "If you're here to cry about some lost job, you're wasting my time." The young man chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it wasn't me you fired." The CEO's brow furrowed. The young man leaned forward, tapping a finger on the polished surface of the desk. "Years ago, a woman walked into this office. Desperate. Pregnant. She begged you for mercy." The CEO's pulse quickened. A memory flickered, buried deep. A woman, young, exhausted, her hands trembling as she gripped a termination notice. Tears in her eyes. He remembered the way she pleaded. "Please. I have nowhere else to go. I have a baby on the way. Just a few more months. I'll work harder, I swear." And he remembered his own voice. Cold. unmoved. Business is business. She had collapsed in his office, sobbing. He had stepped over her and walked out. That was the last time he saw her. Until now. His throat felt dry. I don't remember. The young man smirked. Liar. The CEO clenched his jaw. If you came here looking for money, the young man shook his head slowly. Do I look like I need your money? The CEO glanced at him, really looking this time. His suit was sharp, but not expensive. His hands, steady. No signs of struggle. No desperation. Yet. There was something not quite human about him. The young man continued. She had nowhere to go, you know. You crushed her last hope that day. The CEO exhaled sharply. That was years ago. If you're her son, what do you want from me? The young man's smile disappeared. Answers. The word hung in the air. The CEO scoffed. Answers? About what? The young man's voice dropped to a whisper. About how she disappeared. The CEO froze. Disappeared? His mind raced. Last he had heard, she was struggling but alive. He had never followed up. But now he wasn't so sure. The young man leaned forward. His eyes darkened. She didn't just disappear from society. She disappeared from existence. The CEO's skin prickled. What did that mean? And why did he suddenly feel like this was only the beginning? The CEO's grip tightened on the arms of his chair. His heartbeat was steady, but something inside him was shifting, a slow, creeping unease. He forced himself to maintain control. Enough with the riddles, he said, his voice sharper than intended. What do you mean she disappeared? The young man stared at him for a long moment before exhaling, almost as if he were disappointed. I was hoping you'd remember on your own. The CEO felt a twinge of irritation. I don't have time for games. If you have something to say, say it. The young man tapped his fingers lightly against the desk. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, he said, after you fired her, she lost everything. Her apartment. Her savings. Her health. She had nowhere to go. The CEO swallowed, but his face remained unreadable. So what? Life was hard. He had made tough choices to survive too. She tried everything, the young man continued. Begged for work. Slept on the streets. Went hungry so her child could survive. But the world doesn't care about people like her, does it? The CEO didn't respond. And then, something happened. The young man's voice dipped lower, quieter, like he was speaking about something forbidden. She vanished. Not just in the way people fade into the shadows of society. She was erased. The CEO stiffened. The police never found her. There were no records. No missing persons report. It was like she had never existed. A chill crawled up the CEO's spine. That's impossible. The young man smiled. Is it? The CEO shook his head. This is ridiculous. If you're here to blame me for her choices, she didn't just disappear. The young man interrupted, his voice steady. She was taken. The words sent an odd sensation through the CEO's chest. Taken? By whom? His mind immediately went to human trafficking, or some underground crime network. That wasn't his problem. He hadn't been involved. He fired people. He didn't ruin them. But the young man was still watching him. And you were the last person to push her toward it. Something inside the CEO cracked, just slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying that you did more than fire a woman that day. The young man leaned in, his presence somehow heavier. You set something in motion. And now you're going to understand what that means. The CEO had enough. He stood up, towering over the young man. I don't know who you think you are, but this conversation is over. The young man didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, he said something that made the CEO's stomach turn. Do you believe in things that shouldn't exist? The room fell silent. The CEO's pulse thumped against his skull. The young man smiled again, but this time, there was something different in his expression. Something unnatural. Because you're about to. The office suddenly felt colder. The CEO stood frozen, his mind grappling with the young man's last words. Do you believe in things that shouldn't exist? A ridiculous question. A waste of time. And yet, something about the young man felt off. The CEO forced himself to scoff. I believe in things that make sense. He gestured toward the door. This conversation doesn't. The young man didn't budge. His gaze remained steady, calculating. Then he let out a quiet breath. I thought you might say that. He reached into his pocket. The CEO's muscles tensed. Was this a threat? A gun? A hidden weapon? But instead, the young man pulled out a small, folded photograph. He slid it across the desk. Look at it. The CEO hesitated before snatching it up. He didn't know why his fingers trembled slightly. The moment his eyes landed on the image, his breath caught in his throat. It was an old, faded picture of the pregnant woman. The one he fired. But that wasn't what shook him. It was what stood behind her. A shadowy figure loomed in the background, tall, unnatural, its face obscured, its shape wrong. The CEO's grip tightened on the photo. This is fake. The young man shook his head. No. It's real. And it's the last known picture of my mother before she disappeared. The CEO forced himself to stay rational. So what? It's just a trick of the light. A smudge on the film. The young man smirked. Then why does the figure appear in every photo taken of her after you fired her? Even in different cities? Even when no one else remembers seeing it? A chill ran through the CEO's spine. The young man continued, his voice lower now. Something was following her. Something that shouldn't have existed. The CEO threw the picture onto the desk. Enough. No, the young man said softly. Not enough. Not yet. The lights in the office flickered. The CEO's breath came quicker now. His rational mind screamed that it was just a coincidence, just a faulty bulb. But something deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't known in decades, was whispering the truth. Something was wrong. After my mother disappeared, the young man continued, people tried to investigate. But their records vanished. Their memories blurred. Even those who knew her best started forgetting she ever existed. The CEO's heartbeat pounded in his ears. That's not possible. The young man tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? The CEO slammed his fist on the desk. This is nonsense. For the first time, the young man's expression turned serious. You don't get it, do you? His voice was quiet, but the weight behind it was undeniable. She didn't just vanish. She was erased. And now, he leaned forward, his next words sending an icy terror through the CEO's chest. It's looking for you. The office went completely silent. For the first time in his life, the CEO had no words. Because deep down, beneath all his logic and power and certainty, a single, horrifying thought clawed its way into his mind. What if he was telling the truth? The CEO sat rigid in his chair, his heart beat a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. It's looking for you. The words echoed in his head, slithering into his thoughts, planting seeds of doubt where certainty used to be. He forced a breath, steady, controlled. He was a businessman. A man of logic, of power. He didn't get rattled by nonsense. And yet. "Leave," he ordered, voice sharp. The young man only smiled. That same eerie, knowing smile. "You can tell yourself it's a lie," the young man said. "But something inside you already knows the truth." The CEO opened his mouth to snap back, but the lights flickered again. His fingers twitched. The air in the office felt thicker now, almost pressing against his skin. He told himself it was just his imagination. The young man's eyes darkened. "It's already started." A cold dread settled in the CEO's chest. He didn't want to ask, but the question clawed its way out anyway. "What's already started?" The young man tilted his head, considering him. "It's watching you now." The words sent an involuntary shiver through him. He clenched his jaw. "I don't believe in ghosts." The young man laughed. "Good. Because this isn't a ghost." The CEO swallowed the sudden dryness in his throat. "Then what is it?" The young man didn't answer. Instead, he stood up and took a step toward the office door. A flash of relief ran through the CEO. Good. He was finally leaving. But then, he turned back. "Tonight," he said, "you'll see it." The CEO's stomach twisted. "See what?" The young man's expression remained unreadable. "What you set free the day you fired her." And then, without another word, he walked out. The door closed with an eerie click. The CEO sat in silence, staring at the empty space where the young man had stood. Something was wrong. He knew it. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, that feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. Later that night, the CEO returned to his penthouse, trying to shake off the unease. He poured himself a drink, loosened his tie, and sat by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. This was his world. The empire he built. Nothing could touch him here. And yet, his reflection in the glass felt wrong. He turned his head slightly, observing himself. His suit was crisp, his hair neatly in place. But there was a strange distortion around the edges of his reflection, a faint blur. He leaned closer. Was that there before? His fingers twitched. Just his imagination. The stress of the day messing with his head. He stood up and walked toward the bathroom, trying to shake it off. As he passed the hallway mirror, something moved. He froze. His reflection was standing completely still. But he had just taken a step. A slow, suffocating chill crawled up his spine. He turned his head slightly. His reflection didn't. A sharp breath caught in his throat. That's impossible. And then, his reflection smiled. Not his smile. Something else's. A slow, eerie, stretched smile that didn't belong to him. The CEO stumbled backward, his breath ragged. He turned away, refusing to look again. This isn't real. This isn't real. Then, tap. A sound. Soft. Rhythmic. Coming from the window behind him. He didn't want to turn around. He knew he shouldn't. But something made him. And when he did, it was there. Outside the glass. Watching him. Waiting. His breath stopped. A shape, tall, too tall. Its body shifting, stretching unnaturally. A shadow with no clear form, but eyes that were too many, too wide, too knowing. It had no face, but it was smiling. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't possible. It wasn't real. But the glass started to crack. A single, thin fracture, spreading from the spot where it touched. The CEO stumbled backward, knocking over his glass. His heartbeat pounded against his skull. No. No, no, no. The young man's voice echoed in his mind. Tonight, you'll see it. And now, he had. The thing outside the window tilted its head, its shifting form pressing closer, closer. And then, it raised a hand. A hand identical to his own. And it knocked. Once. Twice. 3 times. Tap. 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 The CEO's vision blurred. His own reflection in the glass was gone. But the thing outside was still there. Smiling. Waiting. And this time, it wasn't leaving. The CEO stumbled backward, his breath ragged, heart slamming against his ribs. The thing outside the window, it shouldn't be real. And yet, it was. The cracks in the glass spread like veins, thin fractures creeping outward, distorting the city lights behind them. The thing on the other side didn't move. It only watched. Tap. 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 The knocking was slow, deliberate. Mocking. The CEO's mind raced for an explanation. A trick of the light? A hallucination? That young man, he must have drugged him. This was all in his head. But deep inside, he knew the truth. Something had been waiting. And tonight, it had come for him. Then, his phone rang. The sharp sound jolted him, grounding him back to reality. He scrambled toward the desk, nearly knocking over the bottle of whiskey. He snatched the phone and pressed it to his ear. Hello? A pause. Then, a voice. I told you, the young man said, his tone unreadable. Now you see it. The CEO's stomach twisted. What the hell is happening? His voice was hoarse, desperate, no longer the calm and controlled businessman he had always been. The young man didn't answer right away. Then, look away from the window. The CEO's breath hitched. His gaze flickered back. The glass was warping now, bending inward, like something was pressing through from the other side. Tap. 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 Louder this time. More impatient. He tore his eyes away, turning his back to it. He couldn't look anymore. What is it? He whispered into the phone. The young man exhaled. It's what happens when you destroy someone so completely, that the universe itself takes notice. The CEO gritted his teeth. This isn't possible. I thought you didn't believe in ghosts. The CEO ran a trembling hand over his face. I don't. Good. Silence. Then, the young man said something that made the CEO's entire body go rigid. Because it's not a ghost. A sharp chill spread through the CEO's chest, like ice replacing his breath. Then what is it? He whispered. The young man's voice was calm. It's her suffering. Given form. The words slammed into him like a fist. His thoughts recoiled. No. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the young man continued. My mother should have died after you fired her. The CEO squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to remember. She was sick. Homeless. Weak. But something found her. And it gave her a choice. The young man's voice darkened. She could die, or she could become something more. The CEO shook his head. You're insane. A quiet chuckle. Maybe. But tell me, is the thing at your window insane too? Tap. 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 Louder now. The CEO's hands shook. He turned, unable to resist, unable to fight the pull. The thing outside the glass was closer. Its face was clearer now. It was smiling wider. And then, it spoke. "Do you remember me?" The CEO staggered back. The voice was wrong, a whisper, an echo, something both familiar and impossible. His vision blurred. His knees gave out. The young man's voice in his ear was soft now. "She became something else. And now, she wants to see you." The CEO couldn't breathe. His past, the decisions he had made, the people he had crushed, the lives he had ruined, had finally come for him. The CEO collapsed into his chair, hands gripping the armrests as though they were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The thing outside the window was no longer knocking. It was waiting. Watching. The city lights behind it flickered, twisted, as if even reality itself was warping in its presence. The shape had shifted, its outline no longer human, but something stretched, unnatural. And yet, its voice had been familiar. "Do you remember me?" His breath hitched. "Make it stop," he whispered into the phone. "Tell me how to make it stop." The young man sighed on the other end of the line. "You already know the answer." The CEO's grip tightened. "I don't." A beat of silence. "Then, you never learned how to take responsibility, did you?" A fresh wave of anger surged through him. "I ran a business. I made decisions. People come and go. That's life." The young man hummed. "And yet, here you are. A powerful man, begging for mercy from something you don't understand." The CEO's jaw clenched. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet. Tap. The sound made his heart stop. Tap. Tap. Slow. Mocking. The thing on the other side of the glass hadn't moved. But the cracks in the window were growing wider. The CEO felt something he hadn't felt in years. Powerlessness. "Tell me what to do," he whispered. A pause. Then, the young man said, "Open the window." The CEO's blood turned to ice. "What?" "You heard me." His breath came fast and shallow. Was this a trap? A trick? "No," he growled. "No, I'm not opening that damn window." The young man chuckled softly. "Then it will break in on its own." The CEO whirled toward the glass. The cracks were crawling now, spiderwebbing across the surface. Thin, delicate lines, stretching closer and closer toward the center. He was running out of time. A trembling breath left his lips. "Why?" he whispered. The young man's voice was patient. "Because you never listened before." The CEO's stomach twisted. "And if I do?" A pause. Then, the answer came. "Maybe, it will listen to you." His throat felt tight. Could that be true? He turned back to the window. The thing on the other side was waiting. It had not attacked. It had not forced its way through. It was giving him a choice. A chance. A cold sweat ran down his back. This was insane. And yet. Slowly, his hand reached for the latch. The metal was cold under his fingers. His breath trembled as he unhooked it. And then, with a single motion, he pushed the window open. The city air rushed in. A cold wind whipped through the penthouse, sending papers flying, toppling over a glass of whiskey. The CEO forced himself to look. For the first time, he saw it fully. The shape standing before him was not just a shadow. It was her. Or what was left of her. Her form flickered, stretched, shifting between a broken, fragile woman and something wrong. Her face was still blurred, still obscured by something unnatural. But through the distortion, through the chaos, her eyes were clear. And they were filled with sorrow. The CEO's breath hitched. He had thought it was hatred. Revenge. A curse. But now, staring into those eyes, he realized. She wasn't here to destroy him. She was here to make him see. His lips trembled. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." For the first time in his life, he meant it. The shadow shivered, like a ripple through water. The cracks in the window stopped spreading. The CEO swallowed the lump in his throat. "I was wrong." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I took everything from you. And I never looked back." He felt something in the air shift. The pressure that had been suffocating him eased. For the first time since this nightmare began, the figure took a step back. The CEO sucked in a shaky breath. He had spent his entire life believing nothing mattered but success. But now, standing face to face with the past he tried to erase, he finally understood. The young man's voice echoed in his ear. "Apologies don't change the past. But they might change the future." And then, the figure disappeared. The air grew still. The city lights returned to normal. The glass remained open, unbroken. The CEO's entire body sagged. It was over. Or at least, he thought it was. Because then, the young man's voice whispered one final thing. "But remember, some debts can never truly be repaid." And the line went dead. The CEO sat frozen in his chair, the phone still clutched in his trembling hand. The line had gone dead, but the young man's last words still echoed in his mind. Some debts can never truly be repaid. His body felt weak, as if the weight of decades of decisions had suddenly crashed onto his shoulders. It was over. Or at least, it seemed that way. He turned toward the open window. The figure was gone. The city stretched before him, bright and uncaring, just as it always had. But something felt different. Something inside him had shifted. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't filled with numbers, profits, or deals. Instead, he thought about her. The woman he had fired. The life he had ruined. And the impossible thing that had come from it. What had she become? And more importantly, why had she spared him? He took a deep, shuddering breath and reached for his whiskey glass. His fingers wrapped around the crystal, but when he lifted it to his lips, he saw his reflection. His hand froze. The glass nearly slipped from his grip. Because in the reflection, his eyes weren't his own. For a single, fleeting second, they were hers. Dark. Knowing. Watching. His pulse hammered against his skull. He blinked, and they were gone. Just his own weary, shaken face stared back at him. He swallowed hard, setting the glass down. He needed to think. The CEO makes a choice. The next morning, the CEO sat in his office, staring at nothing. He had been given a second chance. But now, the question was, what would he do with it? For years, he had built his empire with an iron fist. He made calculated choices, cut off the weak, never looked back. It had worked. But now, he saw what he had ignored. The people beneath his power weren't just numbers. They weren't just expenses. They were lives. He reached for his phone, hesitating only a second before dialing his secretary. She answered quickly. "Yes, sir." He exhaled. "I want the records of all employees we've let go in the past 5 years. A pause. "Sir." "Just get them." "Yes, sir." He hung up. This was the first step. Maybe he couldn't undo the past. Maybe he couldn't bring her back. But he could start fixing what he had broken. He could make sure it never happened again. As he leaned back in his chair, the city stretching before him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear. Not regret. But the possibility of redemption. That night the CEO lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. The apartment was silent. Too silent. He turned onto his side, exhaling softly. His mind was exhausted, his body drained. And then, a whisper. Soft. Gentle. Right in his ear. Good. His entire body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, too slowly, he turned his head toward the darkened corner of the room. And for a single moment, he thought he saw her standing there. Watching. Waiting. Then, she was gone. He swallowed hard, his hands clenching the sheets. His heart pounded. But this time, it wasn't fear that ran through him. It was understanding. The past would always watch him. The question now was, what would he do next? Years later, the CEO sat alone in his office, looking out at the city he once ruled without a second thought. The empire he had built was still standing, stronger than ever. But he was no longer the same man. The ruthless businessman who once fired a desperate, pregnant woman without remorse was gone. In his place was someone older, wiser, and haunted. Not by fear. Not by ghosts. But by the truth. The legacy he left behind. He had spent years undoing the damage of his past. He reached out to the people he once cast aside, helped those who had been abandoned in the name of profit. He created programs for struggling employees, ensured that no one would be discarded the way she was. He paid back the debt he once thought could never be repaid. And yet, the memory of her never left him. She had come to him not for revenge, not to destroy him, but to make him see. And he had. For the first time, he had truly seen. A faint whisper in the wind one evening, as he sat by his office window, watching the city lights, he felt it again. That quiet, unseen presence. It had never left. And maybe, it never would. But this time, it didn't frighten him. Instead, he nodded. A silent acknowledgement. A final understanding. The past never truly disappears. But we can choose what we do with it. The CEO had spent his life believing power was everything. That only the strong survived. That the weak were meant to be discarded. But in the end, he had learned the truth. Power meant nothing if it came at the cost of one's soul. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the lesson she had wanted him to learn all along. The window stood open, the night air drifting in. For the first time in decades, the CEO smiled, a real, human smile. And in the wind, he could almost hear it. A whisper. Soft. Gentle. Good.